This story was sent to me by Sarah Martinez via email, and honestly, it still gives me chills every time I think about it. I was hiding in my bedroom closet, barely breathing, listening to footsteps moving through my house downstairs. The worst part? I knew those footsteps didn't belong to anyone who should be there. But let me back up and tell you how this nightmare started. I was 17 at the time, and my parents had gone out of town for their anniversary weekend. They'd left me alone before, so it wasn't a big deal. I was actually looking forward to having the house to myself. You know how it is when you're a teenager. I could blast music, eat whatever I wanted, and not worry about anyone telling me to clean my room. It was around 10 p.m. on Saturday night, and I was in my pajamas watching Netflix in the living room. Our house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by mature trees that made it feel pretty secluded. Usually, I loved how private it felt. But that night, something about the isolation was making me uneasy. I kept hearing these small noises, creaking sounds that I'd normally attribute to the house settling, but they seemed more frequent than usual, and there was something about the timing that felt off. It wasn't random settling. It was like someone was moving around outside, testing windows or checking doors. Around 11, I decided to do something I'd never done before when home alone. I actually got up and checked all the locks. Front door, back door, sliding glass door to the patio. Everything was secure, but as I was checking the back door, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The patio furniture had been moved. Not dramatically, but our table was definitely in a different position than when my parents left. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the wind had shifted it, or maybe I was just remembering wrong. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone and considered calling my parents, but I didn't want to seem paranoid or ruin their weekend over some furniture that might have moved on its own. That's when I heard it, the distinct sound of our back gate opening. We had this old metal gate that made a very specific squeaking noise whenever it swung open. I'd heard that sound thousands of times throughout my life, and there was no mistaking it. My heart started pounding as I stood frozen by the back door. Through the glass, I could see our backyard, but the security light wasn't on, which meant whoever was out there was being careful not to trigger the motion sensor. They knew exactly where it was positioned. I quickly turned off all the lights in the house and crept to the front window to peek through the curtains. That's when I saw him. A man standing at the edge of our property, partially hidden behind the large oak tree in our front yard. He was just standing there, completely still, watching the house. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This person had been watching our house, probably for a while. He knew my parents were gone. He knew I was alone, and he'd been waiting for the right moment. I grabbed my phone and ran upstairs as quietly as possible, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. I called 911, whispering into the phone that someone was trying to break into my house. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and hide somewhere secure. I chose my parents' bedroom closet because it was the furthest from the stairs and had a solid door that I could lock from the inside. As I huddled there in the darkness, still on the phone with dispatch, I heard the sound I'd been dreading, the back door sliding open. He was inside. The footsteps were slow and deliberate as he moved through the first floor. I could hear him opening and closing doors, like he was searching for something or someone. The dispatcher kept whispering reassurances that officers were on their way, but every minute felt like an hour. I heard him coming upstairs, and I pressed myself further back into the closet, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps paused outside my parents' bedroom door, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he was going to come in. Instead, he moved down the hall toward my room. The sound of my bedroom door creaking open made me want to scream, but I forced myself to stay silent. He was in there for what felt like forever, and I could hear him moving things around, probably looking for me. Just when I thought I couldn't take another second, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world: police sirens getting closer and closer. The footsteps immediately quickened, and I heard him running back downstairs and out the back door. The officers found evidence that he'd been planning this for a while. There were cigarette butts near our back fence where he'd been watching the house, and they discovered he'd disabled our security light earlier that evening. He'd also tried multiple windows before finding the back door unlocked, something I'd forgotten to check when my parents left. They never caught him, which is probably the scariest part of all. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep without checking every lock twice and keeping all the curtains drawn. My parents installed a full security system after that, but I never felt completely safe in that house again. The detective told me later that this guy had probably been watching our family's routines for weeks, waiting for the perfect opportunity when I'd be alone. The thought that someone had been studying us, learning our patterns, planning to break in when I was most vulnerable, it still haunts me to this day. I found this on a Reddit thread by user NightShiftNurse23, and it perfectly captures why being home alone can turn into your worst nightmare. The knocking started at exactly 2:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I was staring at my phone, trying to decide whether to call for help, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me explain how I ended up barricaded in my bathroom at 3 in the morning, convinced that someone was trying to get into my apartment. I was 24 and had just moved into my first apartment by myself. It was a small place on the 3rd floor of an older building downtown. The rent was cheap, which should have been my first red flag, but I was fresh out of college and working at a nonprofit, so cheap was exactly what I needed. The building had about 20 units, but it never felt very populated. I rarely saw other tenants, and the hallways always seemed empty. The landlord, Mr. Chen, lived on the 1st floor and managed the building himself. He seemed nice enough when I signed the lease, but something about him always made me slightly uncomfortable. For the first month, everything was fine. Sure, the building was old and made a lot of noises, but I got used to the creaking and settling sounds pretty quickly. My apartment was cozy, and I loved having my own space for the first time in my life. The weird stuff started in my 2nd month there. I'd come home from work to find my door slightly ajar, even though I was obsessive about locking it. The first time it happened, I figured maybe I'd been distracted and hadn't pulled it completely shut. But when it happened again a few days later, I started paying closer attention. I also noticed that items in my apartment were being moved. Nothing dramatic. My coffee mug would be in the sink when I was sure I'd left it on the counter, or my couch pillows would be arranged differently. Small things that made me question my own memory, but the pattern was starting to feel deliberate. One evening, I was getting ready for bed when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my door. They stopped right in front of my apartment and just stayed there. I looked through the peephole, but the hallway light was out, so I couldn't see anything clearly. The footsteps eventually moved away, but I had this creeping feeling that whoever it was had been listening at my door. The next morning, I mentioned it to my downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd lived in the building for years. Her reaction surprised me. She immediately looked concerned and asked if I'd been having any other problems. When I told her about my door being unlocked and things being moved, she got this worried expression and told me I should probably talk to Mr. Chen about changing my locks. But when I approached Mr. Chen about the lock change, he seemed almost defensive. He insisted that the building was completely secure and that I was probably just forgetting things due to stress from the new job. He refused to change the locks, saying it wasn't necessary and that it would be expensive. That's when I decided to take matters into my own hands. I bought a small security camera that I could hide in my living room, angled toward the front door. If someone was coming into my apartment, I was going to catch them. The camera revealed something that made my skin crawl. On the very first night I had it set up, I captured footage of my door opening at 1:15 a.m. A figure entered my apartment. It was clearly Mr. Chen, using what must have been a master key. He spent about 10 minutes inside, moving around quietly, looking through my things. I was horrified and furious. I immediately started researching tenant rights and planning to move out, but I needed time to save money and find a new place. In the meantime, I bought a door wedge and started using it every night to prevent anyone from opening my door from the outside. That's what led to the night of the knocking. I'd wedged my door shut as usual and was trying to fall asleep when the knocking started. It wasn't the normal knock of someone who expected to be let in. It was persistent, aggressive knocking, like someone demanding entry. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. It was Mr. Chen, and he looked angry, really angry. He kept knocking and trying the door handle, clearly frustrated that he couldn't get in like he usually did. "I know you're in there," he called through the door, his voice low and threatening. I was terrified. Here was this man who'd been illegally entering my apartment for who knows how long, and now he was demanding that I let him in the middle of the night. I grabbed my phone and locked myself in the bathroom, which was the only room with a door that locked from the inside. The knocking continued for another 20 minutes, occasionally accompanied by him trying to force the door handle. I could hear him getting increasingly agitated, and at one point, it sounded like he was throwing his weight against the door. I called 911, but I was whispering because I was afraid he might hear me through the thin walls. The dispatcher said they were sending officers, but it felt like forever before I heard them arrive. When the police got there, Mr. Chen tried to play it off like he'd received a noise complaint and was just checking on things. But when I showed them the camera footage of him entering my apartment, his whole story fell apart. It turned out that he'd been doing this to several female tenants in the building. The police found keys to every apartment in the building in his possession, along with some personal items that belonged to other tenants, things he'd apparently taken during his illegal visits. He was arrested that night, but the whole experience left me completely shaken. The thought that this man had been coming into my home while I slept, going through my personal belongings, watching me, it violated every sense of security I'd ever had. I moved out within the week, staying with friends until I found a new place. I never found out exactly how long he'd been entering my apartment or what else he might have done while I was sleeping. Some questions are better left unanswered, but the experience taught me to trust my instincts. Someone DM'd me this on Twitter, And it's a perfect example of how quickly a normal evening alone can turn into a fight for survival. I was crouched behind my kitchen counter, clutching a knife with shaking hands, listening to someone systematically trying every window in my house. The terrifying part wasn't just that someone was trying to break in, it was that they seemed to know exactly which windows were most vulnerable. But let me start from the beginning and explain how my peaceful night home alone became the most frightening experience of my life. I was 26 and had recently bought my first house in what I thought was a safe suburban neighborhood. It was a small ranch-style home with big windows that let in lots of natural light, something I loved during the day, but hadn't really considered from a security perspective. My boyfriend Jake was out of town for work, which meant I had the house to myself for the weekend. I was actually excited about it. I'd planned to order takeout, catch up on some shows, and enjoy having the space to myself. Around 8 p.m., I ordered Chinese food and settled in for a Netflix marathon. The delivery guy was friendly enough, though I noticed he seemed to be looking around the interior of my house more than necessary while I was getting money for a tip. He asked if I lived alone, which I thought was a weird question, but I just laughed it off and said my boyfriend was in the shower. After he left, I realized I'd made a mistake mentioning a boyfriend at all, because it implied there was usually someone else there. I probably should have just said, yes, I live alone, and left it at that, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I spent the evening watching movies, and actually fell asleep on the couch around 11. I woke up around midnight to the sound of my dog growling low in his throat, something he rarely did. He was standing at the front window, completely alert, staring out into the yard. I got up to see what had caught his attention, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The motion sensor light in my front yard was on, but there was no one visible in the area it illuminated. Someone had triggered it and then moved out of range, but they were probably still out there, just beyond where I could see. Buddy was getting more agitated, moving from window to window like he was tracking something moving around the perimeter of the house. That's when it hit me. Someone was circling my house, staying just out of sight of the motion lights. I quickly turned off all the lights inside and grabbed my phone, trying to decide whether to call the police or wait to see if whoever it was would just leave. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but Buddy's behavior was telling me that this was definitely not normal. As I stood there in the dark, I heard the first attempt at a window, the subtle sound of someone testing whether it was locked. It was one of the windows in my guest bedroom, and I could hear them gently pushing against the frame, seeing if it would give. My heart started racing as I realized this wasn't some random person walking through the neighborhood. This was someone specifically targeting my house, someone who was methodically checking for ways to get inside. I called 911, but I knew it would take several minutes for officers to arrive, and this person was actively trying to break in right now. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and find somewhere safe to hide, but I was worried about Buddy. I couldn't just leave him in the living room if someone managed to get inside. The window testing continued around the house. I could track their progress by the sounds and by Buddy's reaction. Whoever it was seemed to know what they were doing, checking each window systematically and spending extra time on the ones that seemed most vulnerable. When they got to the kitchen window, I heard a sound that made my blood turn to ice. The window sliding open. I had apparently forgotten to lock it after opening it earlier to let in some fresh air while cooking. I grabbed the biggest knife I could find from the kitchen drawer and called for Buddy to come with me. We both crouched behind the kitchen island, and I tried to stay calm while whispering to the 911 dispatcher that someone was now inside my house. I could hear him moving carefully through the kitchen, and I realized he was using a flashlight instead of turning on the lights. He was trying to stay quiet, which meant he was probably planning to find me while I was still unaware he was there.
Buddy was trembling next to me, but he stayed quiet, like he somehow understood we needed to be silent. I could hear the intruder moving through the house, opening doors and checking rooms. When he got to the living room, I heard him pause, probably noticing the indentation on the couch where I'd been sleeping and realizing I was definitely home. His movements became more urgent after that, like he was actively searching for me rather than just exploring. That's when I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of staying hidden, I stood up with the knife in my hand and yelled as loudly as I could. "I've called the police and they're on their way. Get out of my house right now." The effect was immediate. I heard him stumble in surprise, and then there was the sound of rapid footsteps heading back toward the kitchen. I kept yelling, making as much noise as possible, and Buddy started barking aggressively. The intruder went back out through the kitchen window, and I could hear him running across my backyard. I stayed where I was until the police arrived, still gripping that knife and shaking uncontrollably. When the officers searched the area, they found footprints around multiple windows and discovered that he'd actually managed to partially open 2 other windows before finding the unlocked one in the kitchen. They also found a bag hidden in my backyard that contained zip ties, duct tape, and other items that suggested this wasn't just a simple burglary. The most chilling part came later when they connected this break-in to the Chinese food delivery from earlier that evening. It turned out the delivery driver had been casing houses, looking for people who lived alone and identifying which homes had vulnerable entry points. He'd targeted 3 other houses in the area over the past month. They caught him 2 days later trying to break into another house across town. During questioning, he admitted that he'd been planning to wait until I was asleep and then subdue me with the zip ties. I don't even want to think what would have happened if I hadn't woken up when Buddy started growling. The experience completely changed how I think about home security. I installed an alarm system, reinforced all my window locks, and learned to trust my instincts when something feels off. But more than anything, it taught me that sometimes the best defense is making noise and fighting back, rather than trying to hide and hope for the best.